Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network, founder and CEO, John Michael, is reading a textbook. Again, first I read a 2001 world history textbook, which is interesting because it's a textbook written from the perspective pre-9/11, like the days before, published days before, for the school year that started days before 9/11 in 2001, September, or August if you're in the South. And this is an American history textbook from 1940. Long introduction here, but 1940s, before we were in World War II, and this is an American history textbook from that perspective. I think that's interesting, and here it is. It's also from a Catholic school, and it's probably for 5th graders. Chapter 10, Building the West. Settling mountain and plain. Looking for gold. There was gold in California. Could it not be found in other places? The Rocky Mountains seemed like a likely place. There might be gold in the hills. Gold was discovered near Pikes Peak in Colorado in 1859. Soon the news that there was gold in Colorado reached the east. Thousands of eager young men set out for that state, hoping to strike it rich. Their destination was not easy to reach. Many a hardship had to be met, but they were not afraid, for their spirits were high. Their slogan was a brave one: Pikes Peak or bust. The mining population. After the Civil War, there were many soldiers who had nothing to do. Many of these men moved to the region of the gold and silver mines. Conditions in the southern states were very bad. Wherever the armies had fought, the land was destroyed and much property was ruined. Many southern men believed that the life of a miner was the only life for them to follow. They were willing to search for gold. The discovery of gold and silver brought miners into what is now the state of Nevada. Other discoveries of gold and silver were made in Idaho and Montana. Soon the Rocky Mountain region had a fair-sized population. It was composed almost entirely of miners. The mining town. The mining town of the West was a very poor place for a home. The main street was a narrow, muddy road with a few unpainted buildings on either side. Here were to be seen the post office, general store, and the hotel. The hotel was usually small with only 2 or 3 rooms. The diggings were just outside the town. When a miner arrived, he became a prospector. That is, he searched around until he found a place where he thought there was a gold ore. Then he drove a stake in the ground with his name on it. That was called striking out his claim. It gave him rights to any gold that he might find within the claim that he had staked. Well, that's what stake a claim means. If he did strike gold, he was fortunate, and he could continue to work on his claim until the gold petered out. Then he prospected again in some other likely spot. Rocky Mountain states. The search for gold and silver in the Rocky Mountain region helped develop the country. A government of some sort was needed, so the United States organized this region into territories. Later, these territories became the state of Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, and Montana. First white people of the plains. The Great Plains. Thousands of immigrants had crossed the high grassy plains of the east of the Rocky Mountains. They had not lingered on the Great Plains to settle. There was too little water and too few trees. It took a later generation to find out how to farm that land. Before that could take place, the cattleman and his cowboys took possession of these plains. Habits of eating. Americans have always liked to eat meat. In colonial times, people ate game, deer meat, which is called venison, squirrel, rabbit, opossum, and the flesh of other small animals. Thank you. The people also raised hogs for meat. The pork was salted so that it could keep for a long time. Sheep provided mutton. Beef, which we relish, was not eaten then as often as it is now. Cows were raised for milk rather than to kill for flesh. After the Civil War, people began to change their manner of living. They began to move into cities. People were going from the farm into the factory. The farmer could raise hogs and cattle for his own meat supply. This would not be much help to people who lived in cities. Providing meat for a city people to eat was providing meat for a city was a big problem. This problem was solved by cattlemen of the West and by their cowboys. The wild cattle of Texas. There were large herds of cattle in Texas. These animals were the descendants of cattle which the Spaniards had introduced 300 years earlier. Is that so? These cattle were known as long-horned cattle. Oh, because of their great spread of their horns. When the Americans moved to Texas, they found the wild cattle there. Soon, quite a business was built of selling cattle to the people who lived in the southern states. During the Civil War, the cattlemen lost their market in the South. After the Civil War, the herds of cattle in Texas were larger than ever. At the same time, the people living in the cities of the East were demanding more and more beef. Cattle for beef were becoming valuable. The railroads were reaching out into the cow country. Therefore, cattle raising in Texas and also in the north, in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, became an important way of making money. Unfenced prairies. The prairies of the West had thousands of acres of lands covered by rich grass. The prairies became the great cow country of America. There were no fences, and the cattle wandered over the prairies, eating the rich grass and getting fat. Then came Roundup and the drive to the railroad. The Roundup. Twice a year, in the spring and the fall, each cattle owner gathered his cattle at his own ranch. This gathering together of the cattle was called the Roundup. And I'm going to ask for a roundup of my own here. If you're listening still and you're interested in my way of reading and talking, primarily my way of talking, please subscribe. And I'll say it again. If you've made it this far, please subscribe. And if you can, that'd be great. It's free. If you can't, that's okay. Thank you. Every cattle owner could tell his own cattle because they were marked with a special brand. Branding was done with a hot iron, which burned away in part of the hair of the hide. This left a mark, or brand, which lasted a long time, as long as the animal lived. The young calves, which had not yet been branded, followed their mothers, so the cattle calves might not get lost or stolen. They too were branded. The cow towns. Then, when the cattle had reached the proper weight, they were driven to the cow towns of Kansas. Fine cities like Wichita and Atchison had their start as a cow town. These cow towns were convenient shipping points. Here the cattle were placed in cattle yards and then shipped by train to the slaughterhouses of Kansas City or Chicago. The life of a cowboy. The cowboy's life was hard, whether at home or on the ranch. or on the saddle away from the on the cattle drive. There were no fences and no castles. Cattle could roam great distances. There were no fences and the cattle could roam great distances. Often the cattle got lost. It was then the cowboy's task to find stray animals. Sometimes a herd became frightened and began to run wild. This was called a stampede. Only great and daring, skillful riding by cowboys could bring the herd under control. Cattle thieves, called cattle rustlers, often caused the cowboys great trouble. And the great cow country was at its best for about 20 years. Then came the farmer and his barbed wire fences, and the days of unfenced pastures, hundreds of miles wide, were over. People who came to the farms, new farms. The railroad had been a friend to the cattleman. It carried his beef cattle to the market. Now the railroad was to spell the doom for the cattle range, the open cattle range. A large group of settlers came by rail to the west. They They came to raise crops instead of cattle. The barbed wire fence commenced to enclose the prairie. The cattle kings were indignant. They hated the nesters, as they called the farmers. There were quarrels between the cattlemen and the farmers. Wire fences were cut, homes were burned, but in the end the farmers won. Wheat. Wheat might be called the pioneering crop of America. Wheat was moved westward with the frontier. Wheat has grown principally in the northern and middle colonies in the early days. When the Erie Canal was opened up, wheat commenced to be raised with the profit in Ohio. The railroad reached Chicago in the 50s of the last century, 1850s. Then wheat was raised in Indiana, Illinois, and even across Mississippi into Missouri. Wheat was now ready to take over the great cow country of the western plains. Wheat was moving with the frontier. This book's from 1940. I think that we can probably infer, and I may be wrong, that wheat being a primary cash crop of the United States is why the food pyramid, remember the food pyramid, had wheat as the most important food, grain as the most important food in our diet, which has to be wrong. So it's probably just a financial maneuver because we had a lot of land dedicated to wheat and grain. So it was a for-profit move, and the food pyramid was a marketing tool, which it was. And if you'd like to deny it, please deny it in the comments to help the algorithm. The Homestead Act, 1862. Cheap land was what the wheat farmer needed. Congress helped him get that land by a new law. This was called the Homestead Act. Under this act, a settler could get 160 acres of free land. All he had to do was to live on the land he cultivated and cultivate it for 3 years. The dream of the small farmer was to own his own farm. Nevertheless, the farmers going to the Great Plains had many difficulties to overcome. Wood was scarce, as there were few trees. So the farmer's first home was often built of sod. Water, too, was often lacking. Farmers depended upon wells and ditches for water. Wolves and coyotes sometimes destroyed the livestock. At times, the plague of grasshoppers laid waste to the fields. A plague of grasshoppers being locusts. There were times when the cyclone madly whirled across the land. A cyclone is a bad storm with strong winds, and the winter blizzard took its toll on the north. The prairie fire caused horror in the summer. In spite of all the difficulties, the farms extended. The tough prairie sod was turned over. The profitable crop of wheat was raised and marketed. The settlement of Oklahoma. The last great stretch of free land was located in Oklahoma. This land had been set aside as an Indian reservation. There was much more land than the Indians really needed. Right. So the United States bought the land from the Indians. This land was to be thrown open to those who would make homes. There, President Benjamin Harrison, on April 22nd, 1889, as the day for the opening of the Oklahoma Territory. Thousands of Americans came from distant places to get their share of the rich free land. The bugle blows. Guards were stationed at the border so that no one could steal on ahead. As noon approached, about 50,000 people waited along the border. They were all set to jump ahead when the signal was given. A United States officer rode to a mound where he could be seen and heard. Exactly at 12 o'clock, he raised his bugle, sounded a call, and dropped a flag. The race was on. Some settlers rode swift horses. The others drove carriages or urged slow oxen forward. Some of the land seekers had nothing but their own legs to carry them on. That night, there were tent cities at Guthrie and at Oklahoma City. Within a year, 250,000 people had moved into Oklahoma and were coming. And more were coming. In 1907, Oklahoma became the 46th state of the United States. 5 years later, the 47th and 48th states entered the Union, when Arizona and New Mexico were admitted. In 1912, the United States had 48 states. That is why our flag has 48 stars. This book is from 1940. The miner and cattleman and the farmer had completed the settlement in the West. There was no longer any frontier in America. Alaska. It is true that the frontier had passed from the main part of the United States. We had acquired new frontier in far-off Alaska. Alaska is the most northern and western part of North America. Only the narrow Bering Strait separates Alaska from the Russian part of Asia. The Russians had crossed the Bering Strait and had taken possession of Alaska. Only a few adventurers went there to hunt and to hunt the seal for its fur. The Russian government paid little attention to Alaska. The Russians offered to sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million in 1867. Our Secretary of State, William H. Seward, because of the fur seals that were found there, wanted to buy Alaska. People laughed at Seward. They thought Alaska as a worthless ice-bound land fit only for a few Eskimos. They called it Seward's icebox. Our Senate hesitated, but finally took Seward's advice and bought Alaska in 1867. It was some time before the country paid much attention to its new purchase. Finally, it was given a government as a territory. Gold was found there, and many people rushed to its fields. Coal and other valuable minerals were discovered. People found Alaska was far from barren country. It turned out to be a very valuable possession. Its greatest value lies in its furs, fish, and forests. Thank you for listening, and if you made it this far, please subscribe. John Michael at Context is Everything, saying God bless, and thank you.